Living in Germany during Hitler's regime from 1933 to 1945 would have been a terrifying experience marked by one of the most brutal dictatorships in history. Adolf Hitler established an autocratic government that deeply transformed German life and politics, promoting extreme nationalism and a racist ideology that demanded unwavering loyalty to the leader. The Gestapo, the Nazi secret police, was present on every corner, hunting down and punishing anyone who showed signs of resistance with torture or death. Civil liberties were completely eliminated, and any behavior perceived as dissent could result in imprisonment, torture, or execution. Groups such as Jews, Roma, political opponents, and other minorities were systematically persecuted through discriminatory laws like the Nuremberg Laws and horrific plans like the Final Solution. Nazi propaganda distorted reality, making truth unattainable and daily survival a constant physical and psychological struggle. Not only was it difficult to survive physically, but it was also an ongoing battle to maintain one's humanity in a dehumanized society. How could people endure such conditions to survive under the relentless Nazi regime in everyday life? Rise and consolidation of the Nazi regime, surveillance and Gleichschaltung. When Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany on January 30th, 1933, it triggered the establishment of one of the most oppressive regimes in history. Within weeks, the Reichstag fire decree suppressed fundamental civil rights like freedom of the press and assembly, paving the way for the Enabling Act, which granted Hitler near unlimited legislative powers. This swift action marked the beginning of a Germany plunged into tyranny, where personal freedom became unattainable. The process of Gleichschaltung, coordination, became the central mechanism for consolidating Nazi power. It transformed a diverse nation into a monolith of uniform thought, where every aspect of life had to align with the ideology of socialist nationalism. Key institutions, such as the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda led by Joseph Goebbels, became essential tools for spreading Nazi propaganda. Radios, the press, and events like the 1936 Berlin Olympics were used to project an idealized image of the regime and indoctrinate the population. Under Heinrich Himmler's leadership, the Gestapo became the omnipresent eye of the regime, watching every corner of Berlin and beyond with relentless ferocity. Oppression infiltrated all aspects of daily life. Listening to foreign radio stations was a serious crime, and keeping a journal with dissenting thoughts could cost someone their freedom or life. Gleichschaltung also extended into the workforce, where trade unions were abolished and replaced by the German Labour Front, ensuring that the workforce was fully under the state's control. Education became another battleground for the Nazi regime. Classrooms, once spaces for intellectual exchange, were turned into centers of ideological conformity. Teachers became spokespeople for the regime, and textbooks were purged of any decadent content, replacing them with lessons that glorified Aryan supremacy and prepared the youth for service to the Reich. Moreover, Gleichschaltung reached religious institutions, merging Protestant churches into the Reich Church and forcing the Catholic Church into agreements that eroded its moral independence. In the cultural sphere, censorship spread to literature and the arts, with works by dissident authors burned publicly as symbols of non-Aryan resistance. Intellectual figures like Martin Heidegger aligned with socialist nationalism, becoming guardians of the official ideology. Life in Nazi Germany was a constant struggle for physical survival and a daily battle to preserve dignity and humanity in a society designed to dehumanize. Neutrality was considered treason, silence equated to conformity, and any challenge to the regime was seen as a direct threat to the heart of the Reich. This climate of surveillance and repression created a society where absolute loyalty to Hitler and the Nazi ideology was essential for survival. Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich, the main architects of terror, ensured that every instrument of the regime functioned perfectly. Gleichschaltung not only unified the political, economic, and social structure of Nazi Germany, but also demonstrated the destructive power of a totalitarian regime that eliminated all forms of diversity and plurality, imposing a single vision of purity and absolute control over society. The Nuremberg Laws and the architecture of invisible apartheid. On September 15, 1935, A new era of oppression was marked in Germany's history with the promulgation of the infamous Nuremberg Laws. During a meeting held in the city of Nuremberg, the Reichstag passed a set of laws designed to segment the German population and, in particular, strip Jews of their identity and rights as citizens. These laws were not merely an extension of state authority, but a legal instrument for segregation, exclusion, and social destruction. The Reich Citizenship Law and the Law for the Protection of German Blood and Honor formed the basis of a legal machinery that deprived Jews of their citizenship, reducing them to mere subjects without voice or rights. Despite their contributions to the country, even those who had participated in World War I or in the arts and sciences were stripped of their identity and relegated to the fringes of German society. The definition of Jew was expanded to include anyone with 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents, regardless of their faith or religious practices, creating an increasing sense of isolation and helplessness. The laws also imposed severe restrictions on personal and familial relationships. Marriages between Jews and non-Jews were forbidden, and any attempt to violate this prohibition became a crime. In many cases, romantic relationships and marriages were torn apart, creating an insurmountable divide between individuals and their surroundings. The impact was devastating for Jewish communities, as human connections were destroyed by a legal framework that sought racial purity at the expense of humanity itself. The enforcement of these laws led to a culture of even deeper repression, with special tribunals tasked with persecuting, judging, and punishing those who dared to transgress the imposed racial norms. The enactment of the Nuremberg Laws was just the beginning of a series of policies that would culminate in the Holocaust. These laws laid the foundation for systematic persecution, the ultimate goal of which was the eradication of Jews and other groups deemed non-Aryan. The ideology that underpinned these laws was driven by racial fanaticism that dehumanized millions, allowing the Nazi regime to operate with impunity in the persecution of its victims. Racial purity, the nightmare behind eugenics. Under the Nazi regime, the obsession with racial purity was not just a political ideology, but a program of extermination disguised as science. In the dark halls of the Third Reich, eugenics, a twisted pseudoscience, became the tool of a government that did not hesitate to apply fraudulent scientific theories to justify human suffering. Throughout Hitler's regime, this obsession translated into policies of control and elimination of those deemed genetically inferior. If you had lived under the Nazi regime, your life and fate might have depended not on your abilities or values, but on the blood running through your veins. The T4 program, one of the darkest initiatives orchestrated by the regime, revealed the magnitude of this obsession. Under the pretext of improving public health and eliminating hereditary defects, over 70,000 people were killed in medical centers, with the complicity of doctors and nurses who acted as agents of death. The regime promoted a distorted form of mercy, where the elimination of people with physical and mental disabilities was seen as an act of social justice. Hospitals turned into slaughterhouses, concealed the barbarity under the guise of medical treatment, deceiving families with falsified death certificates. But the horror did not end there. Forced sterilization, sanctioned by the law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring, affected around 400,000 people. In this context, the concept of defective genetics led to the mutilation of thousands, condemning them to lives of physical and psychological suffering. The Nazi education system reinforced this message, indoctrinating German youth from an early age with the idea that racial purity was vital for the survival of the people. Children were not only taught mathematics and language, but were trained to become the future soldiers and workers of a Reich that only accepted those considered racially pure. Anyone who dared to question this doctrine faced imminent punishment. The Nazi policy of social control did not only target the undesirables from a racial standpoint, but also extended its reach to all forms of dissent. State surveillance was omnipresent. The espionage and repression system was designed to crush any hint of rebellion, from the smallest conversations to the largest actions. Speaking out against the regime or having an interracial relationship could mean a death sentence. Science became one of the most powerful weapons of the Third Reich, but it was used for monstrous purposes. Prominent figures like Josef Mengele, the infamous Angel of Death, conducted human experiments, torturing prisoners in concentration camps in search of genetic improvements. These experiments not only violated fundamental ethical principles, but also stripped science of its humanity, turning it into an extension of state violence. The perversion of scientific knowledge in the hands of the Nazi regime forever changed the course of history, transforming medical research into a tool of social control and genocide. In Nazi Germany, everyday life was marked by constant fear and absolute control. Racial purity was not just a political goal, but a mandate that determined who lived and who died. In a world where genetics determined your worth as a human being, survival did not depend on your effort or morality, but on whether you fit into a distorted notion of what it meant to be valuable to the regime. If you were born under this ideology, your chances of survival were minimal unless you were considered racially superior. Regardless of your achievements or character, the Third Reich made decisions about your fate based on your origin and the cruel rules of its eugenics. This dark chapter of history is a reminder of what happens when science and politics merge to justify oppression and the destruction of what is most human in society. Living under the Nazi regime not only meant fearing for your life, but also for your very humanity. The machinery of hatred, how Nazi propaganda destroyed lives. The rise of the Nazi regime marked the beginning of an era where hatred stopped being an isolated emotion and became an official message backed by the power of the state. At the head of this machinery of hatred was Joseph Goebbels, Adolf Hitler's minister of propaganda, who understood the importance of manipulating both words and images. Through meticulously designed propaganda, a distorted narrative was created that united the nation under the flag of intolerance and hatred. Nazi propaganda transformed reality into a lethal weapon, permeating all aspects of German life. From newspapers to cinema, every medium was used to spread a worldview that dehumanized the enemy and promoted hatred. An example of this were children's stories, in which the villains were not witches or sorcerers, but grotesque caricatures of Jews. This image not only fueled hatred, but also indoctrinated German youth. The newspaper Der Stürmer, known for its cruel, anti-Semitic cartoons, reached the hands of both adults and children alike. Through these mediums, a distorted view of the Jewish people was instilled, a view that was also reflected in films. Movies like Judd Seuss and The Eternal Jew portrayed Jews as subhuman and demonic beings. Nazi propaganda not only shaped perceptions, but also transformed the ideology of hatred into national law. On November 9, 1938, the hatred sown by propaganda reached its peak with Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. While the murder of a German diplomat by a Polish Jew was used as a pretext, Kristallnacht had been carefully planned. This attack, disguised as a spontaneous response to a Jewish provocation, was actually an organized assault on the Jewish community in Germany. On that fateful night, paramilitary troops destroyed Jewish businesses, set synagogues on fire, and arrested thousands of men, many of whom were sent to concentration camps. But what was truly broken that night was not just the glass in the stores, but the cohesion of a society that had, up to that point, lived in relative harmony. Kristallnacht represented the destruction of lives and the dissolution of communities. Despite the brutality of the attack, Nazi propaganda continued to manipulate reality. It presented Kristallnacht as a justified response to Jewish provocation, distorting the facts and rewriting history. Goebbels' propaganda machine achieved such control over the narrative that much of the population accepted the official version. Hatred, fueled by years of indoctrination, became an ideology embraced by millions. The magnitude of this control is terrifying. Nazi propaganda not only served to gain power, but also to dehumanize and destroy lives. The story of Kristallnacht and the machinery of hatred shows how the manipulation of truth and emotions can turn a society into a breeding ground for genocide and systematic violence. The hidden purge, forgotten groups in Nazi Germany. The history of the Nazi regime is one of cruelty and repression, and while the persecution of Jews is the most well-known, the Third Reich was a place where diversity in all its forms had no place. This was not a battle against a single community, but a war against humanity itself. The distorted vision of a pure society did not only exclude Jews, but it also targeted anyone who deviated from the ideals of a perfect Aryan germ. Imagine for a moment the Berlin of the 1920s, a vibrant place of freedom and culture where sexual norms were challenged and explored openly. However, by the 1930s, that liberation was suffocated under the weight of the regime's repressive laws, especially paragraph 175, which criminalized homosexuality. Men who loved differently were not only persecuted, but also marked with a pink triangle in the concentration camps. In these places, the punishment was even more brutal for them, as the regime considered them not only deviants, but a threat to the purity of the Aryan race and thus unworthy of life. Meanwhile, the Roma and Sinti, whom the Nazi regime derogatorily called gypsies, were viewed as an equally dangerous threat. Nazi propaganda portrayed them as criminals and social parasites, a threat to the Aryan order that needed to be eradicated. Concentration camps like the Zigeunerlager in Auschwitz became places of extreme suffering for these groups. In their lives, music, once a symbol of freedom and joy, became a lament that resonated amidst oppression, while their bodies were transformed into nameless statistics. However, one of the most forgotten groups in the history of Nazi persecution was people with disabilities. Under the T4 program, those who did not fit into the regime's vision of purity were considered lives unworthy of life. Hospitals, which should have been places of care, became centers of extermination, where doctors like Victor Brack and Werner Haider betrayed the Hippocratic Oath and acted as judges and executioners, administering lethal doses or even using gas chambers. This program was a cruel reminder of how science and medicine were perverted in the service of a dehumanizing cause. In all these cases, Nazi propaganda played an essential role, creating a narrative so powerful that it managed to transform the victims into enemies of the state. The radio, cinema, newspapers, and other media were used as megaphones to spread these hateful messages, representing homosexuals, Roma, and the disabled as harmful elements to society. The Nazi propaganda machine not only dehumanized these groups, but erased them from the human narrative, portraying them as subhuman, not only worthy of being persecuted but eliminated. In this context, surviving in Nazi Germany meant fitting into a very narrow view of what was normal or desirable. If you did not meet those criteria, your life was condemned to be a shadow, marked by suffering and often death. This total rejection of diversity, humiliation, and the extermination of those who did not conform to the ideals of the Aryan race formed the backbone of a society that, under the Nazi regime, became a machine of horror, indifferent to human suffering. Nazi femininity, from goddesses of fertility to household slaves. In the early 1930s, if you opened a stylish German magazine, you might come across an image that seemed at odds with the Nazi regime. An elegant woman, dressed in a flowing gown, holding a bouquet of lilies, her face radiant with happiness. This figure was Gertrude Schultz-Klink, the highest-ranking woman in the Third Reich. As president of the National Socialist Women's League, Schultz-Klink embodied a perplexing contradiction: the exaltation of Aryan women to a near mythical level, while imposing on them a destiny of subordination in the domestic sphere. Nazi ideology presented women as the pillars of the Volksgemeinschaft, national community, portraying them as goddesses of fertility and symbols of racial purity. However, this idealization came with a clear demand: a set of family duties that kept them confined to the home. In this vision, women were not just mothers of the Reich, but their worth as human beings was measured by the number of children they could bear. The regime's propaganda glorified the maternal role, but instead of celebrating female freedom, it was a means of confining them to a domestic, subordinate space. A clear example of this policy was the Reich Mothers Service, an institution created to teach young women how to be mothers. Its curriculum left no doubt. Their only vocation was to give birth. Even Hitler, in a dark speech about the future of Germany, described the role of women as one of beauty and motherhood. For the Nazi regime, women were to be beautiful and fertile, but they should not have aspirations outside the home. The irony of this vision was cruel. Instead of encouraging women to pursue careers in fields like medicine, law, or education, the regime pushed them to abandon those professions. The 1933 law for the reduction of unemployment offered loans to young couples to marry, but only if the woman gave up her professional career to dedicate herself exclusively to the family. This Nazi model of femininity seemed trapped between two extremes: the Valkyrie, the mythical warrior from Norse legend, and the traditional German housewife. However, Nazi ideology was also pragmatic. When the war began and men were sent to the front, the regime was forced to send women to the factories. It was not an act of female empowerment, but a wartime necessity. The same women who were once confined to the home now found themselves assembling ammunition or working in industries essential to the war effort. Nevertheless, the official message remained the same. Their ultimate place was in the home, as mothers and nurturers. Despite the restrictions imposed, not all women accepted the role assigned to them by the regime. Some chose to resist actively. Sophie Scholl, a young member of the resistance group White Rose, defied the narrative of Nazi femininity. Her bravery in fighting against the regime, despite her position as a woman, became a symbol of resistance. Sophie and other members of her group were executed, but their legacy endures as a reminder that women could be as brave and determined as men, even in a system that sought to reduce them to mere breeders for future generations. Lost childhoods, the Hitler Youth, and the destruction of innocence. The Hitler Youth was not simply a youth club, but a deeply ideological tool rooted in the Nazi regime, designed to shape the minds of children and turn them into fervent followers of the Third Reich's vision. Founded in 1926, this organization became a central instrument for instilling the principles of National Socialism into an entire generation. By 1936, membership in the Hitler Youth was no longer optional, but a legal obligation for all Aryan children in Germany. Baldur von Schirach, the leader of the Reich Youth, was tasked with overseeing this vast indoctrination campaign, which aimed to create a nation of young soldiers, prepared to defend German racial purity and carry Hitler's vision into the future. The educational plan of the Hitler Youth was designed to transform not just knowledge, but the fundamental values of children. Textbooks were modified to rewrite history and redefine morality, removing any notions of compassion or unity and replacing them with hatred towards Jews, communists, and other races considered inferior. Even traditional fairy tales were adapted to glorify Aryan supremacy and the virtues of the Third Reich. This indoctrination was not superficial or isolated. It was a total campaign that affected millions of young Germans. The famous propaganda film by Leni Riefenstahl, Triumph of the Will, showcased thousands of Hitler Youth members in their most visible act, giving a sense of the scale of this process. But the indoctrination was not limited to instilling hate. The youth were also trained to act according to these feelings. Physical training was an essential part of the program, designed to create strong and healthy bodies that embodied the image of the Aryan warrior. When members of the Hitler Youth reached adolescence, many were already fully prepared for military service. The boys, in particular, participated in war games, simulating real combat with live ammunition. The girls, in turn, were trained for their role as mothers of the Reich in the League of German Girls, where they were taught to idolize motherhood and view their function as breeders of the Aryan race as their greatest contribution to the nation. One particularly disturbing story is that of Alfred Z., a 12-year-old boy nicknamed Lupus, a member of the Wolfman movement, an extension of the Hitler Youth. In the final days of the war, Lupus was responsible for executing a downed American pilot. This child, completely distorted by the regime's ideologies, became a monster, showing an unsettling mix of youthful innocence and ruthless cruelty. One of the regime's fundamental goals was to destroy any family bonds that might challenge the state's ideological narrative. Children were encouraged to report their own parents if they ever criticized the government. In this way, the home became a space of suspicion and fear, where loyalty to the regime was placed above family unity. The Hitler Youth was not just a tool of social control, but a machine for the destruction of innocence. Through its methods of indoctrination, it condemned an entire generation of youth to lives of violence, ideological conformity, and the loss of humanity, leaving indelible scars that would last long after the fall of the Nazi regime. Nazi economic exploitation, looting and forced labor. The Nazi regime not only consolidated its power through violence, but also through an economic system that plundered resources and exploited millions of people. From the onset of occupation, conquered lands were stripped of their heritage, such as stolen art from museums like the Louvre, and natural resources like coal and oil. However, the most perverse aspect was the exploitation of human beings, which became the invisible engine driving the Nazi war machine. Millions of people were forced to work in extreme conditions in concentration camps and factories reduced to mere human tools. This slave labor not only sustained armament production, but also contributed to the construction of projects like the V-2 rockets, built with forced labor from prisoners. In addition to slave labor, the Nazi regime implemented a system of Germanization, abducting children from Eastern Europe to use them as labor and subject them to ideological education. In this context, concentration camps like Auschwitz and Dachau were not just places of death, but hidden factories that fed the Nazi war economy. Economic exploitation under the Nazi regime was a brutal and merciless system, where human beings were treated as expendable resources and occupied countries were seen as mere objects for looting. Human life was reduced to a means to fuel the war and the ideology of the Third Reich. Resistance and acts of rebellion defying the Third Reich. In Nazi Germany, resistance emerged as an act of extreme courage in a regime where fear and repression dominated everything. Despite the absolute control of the Third Reich, multiple forms of defiance emerged, both within civil society and in the infernos of concentration camps, demonstrating the indomitable human will in the face of the most brutal oppression. One of the most emblematic examples of civil resistance are Sophie and Hans Scholl, founders of the White Rose movement. This group of university students, disillusioned with Nazi ideology, distributed leaflets calling for active resistance against the regime. Their execution did not stop their legacy. Their sacrifice became a lasting symbol of moral and ethical struggle. Other significant movements include the Edelweiss Pirates and the Swingjugend. The Pirates, with their plaid shirts and Edelweiss flowers, rejected the rigid indoctrination of the Hitler Youth, using music and fashion as expressions of individuality and freedom. The Swingjugend, on the other hand, secretly gathered to listen to jazz, a symbol of cultural resistance that defied the strict norms of the Third Reich. Within the German army itself, notable fractures appeared, such as the July 20, 1944 plot, organized by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg and other officers. This attempt to assassinate Hitler and take control of the government, although it failed, revealed deep discontent even among the most loyal ranks of the regime. Resistance also flourished in the concentration and extermination camps, where conditions were unimaginably brutal. At Auschwitz, under the command of Rudolf Höss, prisoners were dehumanized and reduced to tattooed numbers. However, figures like Primo Levi documented how some prisoners used their intellect and solidarity to maintain their humanity. In Sobibor, prisoners organized an uprising in October 1943, managing to escape with more than 300 individuals using improvised weapons. Although most were recaptured and executed, their act of bravery forced the Nazis to close the camp. Treblinka was also the site of resistance, where Samuel Willenberg, one of the few who managed to escape, survived to tell his story through art, depicting the atrocities he witnessed and challenging the oblivion imposed by Nazi brutality. Outside of Germany, resistance took equally courageous forms. In occupied France, the Maquis carried out sabotage against German infrastructure, hindering the Nazi war effort. In Denmark, civil society managed to save almost 8,000 Jews from deportation, showing how solidarity and courage could prevail even in times of extreme oppression. Within the concentration camps, prisoners also carried out acts of resistance. In Sobibor, the uprising led by Alexander Pechersky resulted in a mass escape that, although largely tragic, demonstrated the capacity for resistance even in the most dehumanizing environments. At Auschwitz, prisoners organized sabotage and clandestinely cared for the sick, keeping a spark of rebellion alive. In addition to organized movements, individuals like Jan Karski, a member of the Polish resistance, risked their lives to alert the world about the horrors of the extermination camps. His testimony, initially dismissed, is now recognized as a fundamental denunciation of global indifference to genocide. The Nuremberg Trials, confronting the legacy of Nazi horror. After the end of World War II, the world had to confront the horrors wrought by the Nazi regime. The Nuremberg trials represented a monumental effort to bring the perpetrators of the crimes committed during the conflict to justice. These trials became a stage where history and humanity faced the challenge of dealing with the brutality that marked the conflict. On November 20th, 1945, the trial in Nuremberg began, an event that drew worldwide attention. It was a legal process that judged not only war crimes but also genocide and crimes against peace. The courtroom became a battlefield where the scales of justice were tipped under the weight of the atrocities committed. The accused, including high-ranking figures like Hermann Göring, were at the center of a trial that became a historical spectacle where heart-wrenching testimonies were heard, such as that of Marcel Vaillant-Couturier, a survivor of Auschwitz. Her account shook the room, and even the impassive Göring looked away, as if the harshness of her words had pierced him. One of the most interesting aspects of the trials was the use of IBM translation technology, which allowed for almost instantaneous translation into 4 different languages, reflecting the magnitude of the event. In this court, the term crimes against humanity was coined, a concept that marked a before and after in international law. Robert H. Jackson, the U.S. chief prosecutor, described the trial as one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason, although the trial also revealed the moral complexities involving the accused. Gustav Gilbert, a psychologist from the SS, interviewed Göring and discovered that, instead of a rabid ideologue, he encountered a rational, almost bureaucratic man who viewed the crimes as an administrative matter. This moral labyrinth demonstrated that justice was not an easy path, and the Nuremberg trials reflected the struggle between reason and barbarism. Although the Nuremberg trials led to the creation of new international norms, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, they also left open questions about whether an adequate reparation could ever be made to the victims of the Holocaust. Beyond the condemned, figures like Adolf Eichmann, who managed to escape trial in Europe and lived peacefully in Argentina until his capture in 1960, raised doubts about the effectiveness of the trials and the system's ability to pursue all the responsible parties. Decades later, cases like that of John Demjanjuk, a man accused of being the guard Ivan the Terrible at the Treblinka extermination camp, continue to add layers of complexity to the question of post-war justice. His trial, held long after Nuremberg, revealed the ongoing struggle to close a chapter in history that refused to be forgotten.